I'm Dr. Lucy Rapson. I'm a senior painting conservator at the Hamilton Carr Institute, which is the part of the Fitzwilliam Museum that specialises in painting conservation. I'm interested in the methods and materials of ancient and medieval art, and I teach the painting conservation students here the reconstruction of paintings using historically informed methods. I undertook the conservation of the 4 mummy portraits at the Fitzwilliam Museum a number of years ago, including on the portrait mummy. More recently, I undertook a reconstruction of a mummy portrait for the 2016 exhibition Death on the Nile. Mummy portraits were made between the 1st and the 3rd centuries AD, at which time Egypt was a province of the Roman Empire, and about 1,000 of them survive today. I think that the portraits have a great deal of appeal because they appear so lifelike and so fresh. Although the first portraits were uncovered and rediscovered in the 17th century, the vast majority of them were excavated in the 19th and 20th centuries, and so they haven't been uncovered from the tombs for very long, so the colours remain very fresh and vibrant. The portrait I'm going to be reconstructing is of a woman called Demos. Her name is known from the wrappings on her mummy, and the portrait's now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. She was excavated by the British archaeologist Sir William Flinders Petrie in Hawara in Egypt. Petrie excavated around 150 portraits over 2 archaeological seasons at Hawara, and he described them as relatively rare, occurring on roughly 1 in 100 mummies. The painting process begins with the wooden board. Not all mummy portraits were painted on wood, although the majority were. There are some examples found on linen and on papyrus. Wood was not readily available in Roman Egypt, so a lot of it was imported. The boards were usually oriented with the grain running vertically. Quite a few different species could be used, for example sycamore fig or tamarisk, which were local, or imported wood such as lime. It's likely that the panel of Demos was painted on lime wood because it is characteristically thin. Dr. Jeff Killen has prepared several boards for my mummy portrait reconstruction using original methods. You can see, looking here, that there are saw marks, and looking at the front there's a lovely smooth surface, perfect for painting on, and a slight curvature to the board as well. Paint consists of the pigment, medium and diluent, and these vary in proportion to alter the properties of the paint, for example how it flows, whether it's raised, what kind of gloss it has. This is a yellow ochre that is a silt, and I'm going to grind it so that it can be used as a pigment. Mummy portraits are usually divided into 2 types according to the medium in which they're painted. There are the encaustic paintings painted in hot beeswax, and there are the tempera paintings which were painted in animal glue, sometimes with the inclusion of plant gums. There's also a type of modified beeswax which meant that the painting could be painted cold, but the detection of this is very, very difficult using analytical methods. The tooling on the Demos portrait indicates that it is an encaustic painting, so it was done in hot wax. Beeswax has a melting point of 62 to 64 degrees C, so it's solid at room temperature. So it has to be heated up and combined with pigments in order to be painted, and it has to be painted very quickly. It is likely that some diluents or additives were included in order to alter the flow properties of the paint, and you can see this by looking at the pink robe, for example. A recent study by the Getty into 51 mummy portraits has found the presence of some additives, for example some resins, but also mustard oil. So I will be experimenting with these. Some mummy portraits have ground layers and some do not. The portrait of Demos has got a ground layer, so I will begin by replicating this. I do not know the medium of this layer, but I am going to reconstruct it using encaustic and replicating its colour and painting it all over the surface of the panel. The pigments of the Demos panel were identified by a team from the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and they used a method called X-ray fluorescent spectroscopy. They identified lead white and calcium carbonate or sulfate. The method they used cannot differentiate between the two. They found carbon black, either soot or charcoal. They also found yellow and red ochre, the green which is used to do the necklace they found was a copper green, perhaps malachite or a synthetic copper green, and they also found the organic red pigment madder used to decorate the pink robe. Madder is a plant-derived pigment. It comes from the madder plant. And what I'm going to do now is melt some beeswax and add some madder, and you'll notice there's quite a colour change when that happens. It's quite gritty, this paint, so I'm grinding it using this spatula. I'm going to mimic these findings as closely as possible, but I have to make certain choices. So for example, I'm not going to use the toxic pigment lead white. I'm replacing that with a modern pigment, titanium white. I'm going to use soot black rather than charcoal, and I'm going to use synthetic copper green as opposed to malachite. Demos is fairly typical in the range of pigments used. Some other portraits had some other pigments, for example Egyptian blue, but what we see on Demos is fairly usual. I'm copying an existing painting rather than drawing from life, so I need to find a way of transferring the design very accurately. One is a method called pouncing. In this, I take a photograph of the portrait of Demos at scale and then make a sequence of little holes using a point around all of the principal design lines. Then this can be laid on top of the panel that I'm reconstructing, and I can take a carbon powder, a charcoal powder, and rub this through the holes. And then when you remove the drawing, this reveals a sequence of little lines which can then be reinforced at the underpainting stage. By looking closely at the original portrait and even at photographs of it, it is possible to see the sequence of painting and the different stages in which it was applied. Once the underpainting had been done, there was actually a second grey paint put onto the background at one side of the portrait to lend the background some three-dimensionality. After that, the pink robes were applied next, using again quite a dilute paint and using brushes. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder describes 3 tools for encaustic painting in his Natural History: the cestrum, the cauterium and the penicillum. One of the key instruments is the penicillum, or the brush, and here are 2 examples. This is an Egyptian style brush that was made by my colleague Elspeth Geldof, and this is its modern equivalent. And you can see in the portrait of Demos that a brush of about 2.5 centimetres was used to make the ground layer, which serves as the background. The hair and the flesh were blocked in using a brush first of all, and then further details were usually added using the tools, although some of the final details were also done with a very fine brush, particularly in the curls. And this is a method that you see on a lot of mummy portraits and seems to have been quite a standard way of depicting hair. This is the tool I've been using as the cestrum. It's a small pointed needle-like tool and it's used for scratching. I've been using 2 tools as the cauterium, this more pointed palette knife and this more rounded spatula, and I'm able to heat both of them up and then use them. If you look along the lines of Demos's neck, you can see the use of both the sharp pointed cestrum but also the spatula-like cauterium as well, and it's been very methodically worked in rows, very, very distinctively. I'm also able to apply paint with them as well, for example for the highlights of the beads. As the painting progresses, it gets steadily thicker. The background and the robe, for example, are painted quite thinly using a brush, but the flesh paint and the hair and so on are painted instead mainly with the tools and have quite a lot of texture, and this helps the whole of the painting come forward, especially in the details such as the hairpin, the necklace and the earrings, which are among the last details that are on the painting. The portrait genre was well known in Roman art, and portraits represented a genuine likeness, although that could often be idealised. We don't know whether mummy portraits were painted from life or of the recently deceased, both is possible. And when the time came for the portraits to be wrapped into the mummies, the upper corners of it were trimmed and it was bound into the wrappings, often attaining a curvature over the face.